I didn't know my life was about to split cleanly into a before and an after when he said it. "If you take that job," Colin said, his voice flat, eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, "we're done. I'm not leaving Chicago." The words landed quietly. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a sentence that rearranged 5 years of my life in one breath. I remember sitting there, my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, thinking how strange it was that something so devastating could sound so reasonable, like he was simply stating the weather. Chicago was his world, his job, his parents, his studio, his friends, and I was expected to orbit it. Always had. So when I said, "then we're done," it didn't come out angry. It came out tired. Months later, I'm sitting in a glass-walled corner office in Seattle, watching gray light roll in over Puget Sound as my first batch of stock options officially vests. My calendar is blocked for a board presentation in an hour. My phone is silent. And somewhere back in Chicago, Colin is crying in front of a small claims judge, accusing me of emotional damages, of ruining his life by choosing mine. Apparently, in his version of the story, I'm the villain. I'm Rena Peterson, 30 years old, former data analyst, current director of analytics at a healthcare startup that works on machine learning models for patient outcomes. I'm writing this from my new apartment because I need to understand how the man I lived with for 3 years turned into someone I barely recognized the moment I stopped letting him decide my future. We were together 5 years. 5 years. We built routines, shared holidays, talked about someday like it was a place we were both walking toward. I loved him, truly. But looking back now, I can see how quietly my life kept bending, how my choices shrank to fit the space he allowed. I thought leaving would be hard, but simple, painful, but clean. What I didn't expect was what came after. Because once I walked away from his control, Colin didn't just let me go. He rewrote everything we were and declared war on the woman who dared to choose herself. And that was only the beginning. Before everything collapsed into ultimatums and court dates, before my name became something Colin whispered with bitterness, I was just a woman in love, doing what I thought love required. I met Colin Morrison when I was 25. I had just finished grad school and landed my first real job as a data analyst in Chicago. I was ambitious, maybe a little idealistic, convinced that if you worked hard and stayed kind, life would meet you halfway. Colin was charming in a grounded, reassuring way. He worked in a boutique studio connected to the fitness and wellness world, surrounded by people who talked about balance, community, and roots. He made Chicago feel permanent in a way that was comforting at the time. We started dating casually. Coffee after work, long walks by the lake, weekends that blended into each other until it felt strange not to be together. He liked to say I was the smart one, and I liked that he admired my mind. When he asked me to move in after 2 years, it felt like a natural next step. The apartment was his dream apartment, close to his job, close to his parents, close to the studio he loved, like an extension of himself. I told myself it didn't matter. An apartment was just an apartment. Relationships were about compromise. So I compromised. We lived together for 3 years. On the surface, things looked stable. We split expenses evenly: rent, utilities, groceries. Colin insisted on keeping our finances separate. He said it was modern, independent. I agreed, even though part of me thought sharing a life should mean sharing a little more trust. Our routines revolved around his world. Vacations were trips to visit his parents in Wisconsin or his college friends in Minneapolis. When I suggested somewhere new, California maybe, or even a quiet beach, he'd smile, tilt his head, and say, "That's not really my thing." And somehow, my ideas always became the ones we postponed. Even small things followed the same pattern. When I bought a car, I wanted a practical Honda. Colin frowned, said it wasn't safe enough. His dad recommended a Subaru. "They hold value," Colin said, like that settled it. I bought the Subaru. I told myself I was being reasonable. That was the pattern of our relationship. His preferences came wrapped in logic, and mine came labeled optional. Still, I loved him. Or at least, I loved who I believed we were. I believed that when something truly mattered to me, he would show up the way I always had for him. My career mattered to me. Data analytics wasn't just a job. It was the thing that made me feel capable, powerful, alive. I worked late nights, took extra certifications, followed developments in machine learning because I wanted more than stability. I wanted growth. Colin supported me in theory. He liked saying he was proud of me, but in practice, my ambition always seemed to be something that had to fit neatly inside the life he'd already decided on. Looking back now, I can see the signs. The way he went quiet when I talked about long-term goals that didn't involve Chicago, the way decisions always seemed to drift back to what was easiest for him. At the time, I dismissed it. Love isn't about keeping score, I told myself. I didn't realize I was slowly erasing parts of myself to keep the peace. And I definitely didn't realize that the first time I refused to shrink, he would choose control over partnership without hesitation. The first real shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as practicality, concern, even care. It started the year before everything fell apart. When my workload increased and my responsibilities expanded, I was being trusted with more complex projects, predictive models, leadership over junior analysts. I came home energized, talking about possibilities, about where this path could lead. Colin listened, but his smiles didn't reach his eyes anymore. "You're working a lot," he said one night, not accusing, just stating it. "I'm building something," I replied. "This is important." He nodded, but later that week, his mother mentioned how worried Colin was that I was burning myself out. His father joked, half-joked, that careers come and go, but roots matter more. I laughed it off, but the message lingered. Somehow my ambition had become a family discussion. Then came the comments that were harder to explain. "You don't really need to push this hard," Colin said once while we were cooking dinner. "I like pushing myself," I answered. "But we're already comfortable," he replied. We. As if comfort was the end goal. When I traveled for conferences, he'd ask detailed questions. Not curious ones, but careful ones. Who I talked to, how late the events went, whether the people I worked with were the kind who move around a lot. It felt like concern, until it started to feel like monitoring. The atmosphere at home changed too. Conversations that used to flow now stalled. When I suggested hypothetical futures, what if one day we lived somewhere else? He'd go quiet, then change the subject. When I pressed, he'd sigh, like I was exhausting him with unrealistic thoughts. His friends mirrored him. At dinners, they joked about Chicago lifers versus people who can't settle. I noticed how often their eyes landed on me when those words were said. I told myself I was being sensitive. The truth was, I didn't want to see it. I had invested 5 years, 3 of them under the same roof. I had woven my life around his, adjusted my expectations, muted my instincts, learned when to stop pushing. Admitting something was wrong would mean admitting that love hadn't been enough. The job posting appeared in my inbox on an ordinary Tuesday. A director of analytics role at a health tech startup in Seattle. Machine learning applications for patient outcomes. A leadership position. Equity. A salary jump so dramatic I read the number 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I didn't apply right away. I reread the description, my heart pounding, and thought, this is it. This is what I've been working toward. When I told Colin I was considering an interview, his reaction wasn't anger. It was silence. He stared at the floor, jaw tight, like I'd just spoken in a language he didn't want to understand. Minutes passed before he finally looked at me and said, "You're not seriously thinking about this." I told him I was, that this was my field, my dream role. That was the first moment I felt something fracture. Not because he was afraid of change, but because he didn't ask a single question about what the opportunity meant to me. In that silence, I realized something terrifying. Colin didn't see my future as something we should build together. He saw it as something that should stay exactly where he was comfortable. And that realization planted a seed of doubt that I could no longer ignore. The day I told Colin I'd been invited to the final interview, the apartment felt different, smaller somehow, like the walls were already closing in. I waited until after dinner. He was rinsing dishes at the sink, his back to me, the sound of running water filling the silence I didn't know how to break. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. "They want to fly me out to Seattle," I said carefully. "Final round." He turned slowly, drying his hands like he needed something to do with them. His expression wasn't shocked. It was guarded. "So it's serious," he said. "Yes," I answered. "It really is." He didn't congratulate me. He didn't ask about the company or the work. He just leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "I don't see how this works," he said. "We can talk about it," I replied. "There are options. Long distance for a while. I could fly back once a month. I even thought about renting a small place at first, just to see." No, he cut in, sharp, final. I stopped. No, what? No to all of that, Colin said. I'm not doing long distance. I'm not moving. My life is here. The room felt too quiet after that. I'm not asking you to decide right now, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I just want us to talk. He exhaled slowly, like I was asking too much. Rena, my parents are here. My studio is here. My friends are here. I've built something. I'm not throwing that away. I'm not asking you to throw it away, I said. I'm asking you to consider me. That was when his eyes hardened. If you take that job, he said, each word deliberate, we are done. I am not leaving Chicago. For a moment, I didn't understand what he was saying. My mind kept searching for the part where he softened it, where he added, but we'll figure something out. He didn't. I sat down because my legs suddenly felt unreliable. You're giving me an ultimatum. I'm setting a boundary, he replied. If you loved me, you'd stay. That sentence hurt more than the ultimatum itself. I tried to reason with him. I laid out numbers, how the salary jump could change our future, how the equity could mean real security, how the work aligned perfectly with everything I'd trained for. I talked about timelines, about compromise, about sacrifice being a two-way street. He refused every option. No, I won't. That's not what I want. Each answer landed like a door slamming shut. That night, we went to bed without resolving anything. He fell asleep quickly, his back turned toward me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last 5 years in my head. Every decision we'd made, every time I'd adjusted instead of insisting. Every moment I'd told myself love meant flexibility, my flexibility. And suddenly, with brutal clarity, I understood something. This wasn't about Seattle, this was about control. In 5 years together, every major choice had gone his way. Where we lived, how we spent holidays, how our life looked from the outside. And now, for the first time, something mattered more to me than his comfort, and he wouldn't even discuss it. I realized I had become someone who needed permission to grow. Sometime before dawn, I made my decision. I accepted the offer 2 days later. I didn't tell Colin. I quietly found a short-term sublease in Seattle through a company contact. Arranged movers for the few personal things that were truly mine. Clothes, books, my laptop, a few framed photos. I left behind the furniture, the decor, everything that screamed his taste. On the morning I left, I placed an envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside were 2 months of rent, my key, and a single sheet of paper. You told me if I took the job, we were done. I believe you. I walked out without looking back. I thought that would be the end. I was wrong. Seattle greeted me with rain and unfamiliar silence. For the first few days, everything felt unreal, like I was living someone else's life. Corporate housing, new badge, new coworkers, who spoke in fast, confident sentences about projects that actually mattered. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. I kept waiting for my phone to explode with messages. Anger, accusations, maybe grief. That would have been normal. That would have meant the relationship ended the way relationships usually do. Messy, painful, but honest. The first text came 3 days later. How could you do this to me? I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. You told me if I took the job, we were done. The response came immediately. I didn't think you'd actually choose it over us. There it was, the expectation, the assumption that my future was negotiable, but his wasn't. Over the next week, the messages oscillated between guilt and fury. 5 years meant nothing to you. Everyone thinks you abandoned me. I supported you through everything. I reread them late at night, my chest tight, wondering if I had been cruel, if leaving without a final conversation made me heartless. I replayed our last night together over and over, searching for a version where I could have done something differently. But every time doubt crept in, the memory of his ultimatum rose up and cut through it. If you loved me, you'd stay. That wasn't love, that was leverage. The first call from his mother came a week later. She was crying, talking about how devastated Colin was, how he couldn't sleep, how I'd blindsided him. She asked if I realized how fragile he was, how much he had given me. I listened quietly, hands trembling, until she said, "He's financially ruined, Rena." That's when something cold settled in my stomach. Ruined how? I asked. You drained him, she said softly. He says you took everything and left him with nothing. I hung up after that. Because it wasn't just untrue, it was impossible. We never had joint savings. We split everything evenly by his insistence. I had receipts for every payment, every transfer. I had left him money when I moved out. I had taken nothing that wasn't mine. And yet somehow I was being rewritten into a villain I didn't recognize. The next escalation came when Colin showed up at my mother's house. My mother called me in tears. She said he sat on her porch for hours, crying, telling her I was emotionally abusive, that I isolated him, that I controlled his finances, that he had been afraid to speak up. I could hear her confusion through the phone, the doubt. "Is there something about your relationship I didn't know?" she asked carefully. My hands shook as I sent her screenshots. His ultimatum, time-stamped, undeniable. Messages where he refused compromise. Proof that the end had been his choice as much as mine. She read them quietly. Then she said, "Oh, honey, he lied to me about everything." That should have been a relief. Instead, it terrified me. Because this wasn't just heartbreak, this was strategy. The first public posts appeared soon after. Instagram stories, tearful selfies, captions about being abandoned after sacrificing everything, about emotional damage, about financial abuse. People I hadn't spoken to in years started viewing my profile. Old acquaintances unfollowed me. Mutual friends went silent. I didn't respond. I didn't post. I focused on work, on learning names, systems, expectations. I told myself the truth would be enough. But deep down, I could feel it building. This wasn't over. And whatever Colin was becoming, he wasn't done trying to punish me for refusing to stay small. If the breakup had been a wound, the weeks that followed were the infection. From Seattle, I watched my old life distort in real time. It started with social media, carefully curated grief. Photos of Colin staring out of cafe windows, captions about betrayal and rebuilding, posts about financial abuse and emotional labor that never named me directly but didn't need to. Everyone who knew us knew exactly who the villain was supposed to be. Friends I'd once laughed with stopped replying. A few muted me entirely. Silence became its own kind of accusation. Then the calls began. His father emailed first. A long, formal message demanding I send $40,000 as a transition settlement. He wrote about moral responsibility, about how Colin had supported my career emotionally and domestically, about how fairness didn't always align with legality. I read the email twice, my stomach turning. We had split chores, split bills, split everything. There was no hidden debt, no agreement, no promise of support. I didn't reply. That's when Colin escalated. A mutual friend, Emily, reached out, hesitant. She said Colin had been telling people I drained a joint savings account and left him financially destroyed. When she asked for details, bank names, dates, he got defensive, changed the subject. I opened my laptop that night and pulled up everything. Bank statements, payment histories, Venmo logs, rent transfers, every transaction labeled, dated, accounted for. Not because I expected to need them, but because something in my gut told me I would. 2 days later, I was served at my new office. A small claims lawsuit, emotional damages, unpaid domestic partnership obligations, $8,000. I stood there holding the envelope, heat creeping up my neck, aware of coworkers passing by. Humiliation burned hotter than fear. My company's legal team noticed immediately. They offered help without hesitation. They reviewed the filing and told me, kindly, that it was baseless, frivolous, but I would still have to appear. The lawsuit didn't exist to win. It existed to scare me. That night, alone in my apartment, doubt crept in again. Not about the facts, but about myself. Had I missed something? Had I been careless with his feelings? Was I cruel to leave the way I did? This is how gaslighting works. Not by inventing lies, but by repeating them until you start questioning your own memory. Then my mother called again. This time she was angry. "Raina," she said, "he came back." He had tried to convince her I was unstable, that I'd manipulated him into supporting my ambitions, then abandoned him. She told me the story fell apart when he couldn't explain basic facts. Dates, finances, timelines. He kept talking in circles, she said. It felt rehearsed. That word stuck with me. Rehearsed. In Chicago, Colin was losing control of me, so he was trying to control the story. Emily confirmed it days later. Colin had been calling my former boss, telling him I was emotionally volatile, that I left Chicago in disgrace, that employers should be warned. My old boss, thankfully, didn't believe him. He called me instead, told me the whole thing made him uncomfortable, told me my work had always spoken for itself, even offered future consulting work. Colin's attempt to destroy my professional reputation had backfired. But the damage was real. I stopped sleeping well. I flinched when unknown numbers called. I felt exposed, like my life was being audited by someone who resented my independence. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, something shifted. I stopped feeling guilty, because guilt requires uncertainty. And I finally saw the pattern clearly. When I complied, I was loved. When I chose myself, I was punished. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me resolute. I would show up to court. I would bring the truth. And I would stop apologizing for refusing to be controlled. What I didn't know yet was that the courtroom would become the place where Colin's carefully constructed reality finally collapsed, publicly, decisively, and irreversibly. The week before court was the darkest stretch of my life, not because I thought I would lose, but because I was exhausted from defending a reality that should never have been questioned in the first place. I flew back to Chicago alone. Sitting by the window on the plane, watching the clouds thicken beneath us, I felt the full weight of how much had changed. This city had once been home. Now it felt like a place I had to survive. I stayed at a small hotel near the courthouse. Every night, I laid out my documents on the bed like armor: bank statements, screenshots, receipts. Proof of a life lived honestly. Proof that shouldn't have been necessary. And yet I couldn't shake the dread. Because courts aren't just about facts. They're about stories. And Colin had been telling his for months. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I replayed everything: our years together, the ultimatum, the morning I left. I wondered how someone I once trusted with my most vulnerable thoughts could now look at me and lie without flinching. What hurt most wasn't the lawsuit. It was the erasure. In his version of events, I wasn't a woman who loved deeply and compromised often. I wasn't a partner who showed up, paid her share, and tried to build a future. I was reduced to a caricature, a user, a manipulator, a villain. That kind of rewriting does something to you. It makes you feel invisible. The morning of court, my hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow. I wore a simple navy dress. Nothing dramatic. I didn't want to look like I was performing. I wanted to look like the truth. When I walked into the courthouse, I saw Colin immediately. He looked smaller than I remembered, tired. His eyes darted around the room like he was checking who was watching. Beside him was his father, carrying a thick binder, 3 inches wide, stuffed with highlighted pages and sticky notes. It looked impressive, intimidating. For the first time since this all began, a flicker of fear slipped in. What if the noise overwhelms the facts? What if emotion wins over evidence? I sat alone on my side of the room. My folder was thin, clean, almost understated. When the judge entered, the room stilled. Colin went first. He told his story with practiced sorrow, about how I controlled finances despite insisting on separate accounts, about how I abandoned him without warning, ignoring the ultimatum he gave me, about how the relationship itself was an implied contract, and how my departure caused irreparable emotional harm. His father tried to interject, launching into speeches about morality, about what a real partner owes. The judge shut him down twice. I watched Colin as he spoke. His voice wavered in the right places. He cried on cue. And for a moment, a terrifying moment, I understood how convincing he must have sounded to people who didn't know the details. That was the darkest moment. Not fear of losing money. Fear of being believed over. When it was my turn, I didn't speak much. I didn't argue. I simply handed over the truth. The judge flipped through the documents silently. Bank statements showing separate accounts. Payment histories proving equal contribution. Receipts for the rent and deposit I left behind. Then the screenshot. The ultimatum. The judge looked up. "Is this your phone number, Mr. Morrison?" "Yes," Colin said quietly. "Did you send this message stating that if Ms. Peterson took the job, the relationship would be over?" Colin hesitated. I was upset. "That wasn't the question," the judge said calmly. "Did you send it?" "Yes." That was it. The room felt suddenly lighter, like a storm breaking. The judge closed the folder. "Case dismissed." 15 minutes. Colin unraveled. He shouted about injustice, about systems failing men, about how I manipulated evidence. His father had to escort him out as he sobbed, his carefully constructed narrative collapsing under its own contradictions. I sat there stunned, not relieved, not triumphant, just empty, because winning doesn't heal you. It only confirms what you already knew. And as I walked out of that courthouse, I realized the hardest part wasn't over yet. The truth had won, but the fallout was just beginning. The courtroom doors closed behind me with a sound that felt final. Not triumphant, not celebratory, just final. Outside, the Chicago air was sharp and cold, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without bracing myself. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Messages from Emily, from my mother, from people who had quietly watched the situation unfold and were now processing what it meant. But the real turning point didn't come from the judge. It came from what I learned afterward. Emily and I met for coffee before my flight back to Seattle. We sat by the window, steam rising from our cups, the city moving on around us like nothing monumental had just happened. She hesitated before speaking. "There's something you should know," she said. She told me about the calls, about how Colin had contacted my former boss, trying to get me blacklisted, about the story he'd spun, unstable, irresponsible, financially destructive, about how my boss had listened politely and then called me instead. I pulled up the email on my phone. I'd read it already, but seeing it again in that moment hit differently. "Rena, I got a very concerning call today. I want you to know your professionalism was never in question. If you're ever open to consulting remotely, we'd welcome it. Your departure was a loss for us." Colin hadn't just tried to punish me emotionally. He'd tried to destroy my future, and failed. Something inside me hardened, not into anger, but clarity. On the flight back to Seattle, I watched the city disappear beneath the clouds and realized I was done defending myself, done explaining, done hoping he'd suddenly understand. I didn't need closure from him. I needed distance. Back in Seattle, life kept moving forward. Work was demanding, invigorating. I was trusted, respected. My ideas mattered. The contrast to how small I'd felt before was stark. And then there was Marcus. We met at a professional networking event, two people talking shop over lukewarm wine. He was a UX researcher at a different company. Thoughtful, curious. He asked questions that weren't designed to steer me, just to understand me. We took it slow, transparent. I told him everything early on. The ultimatum, the lawsuit, the chaos. I half expected him to flinch. Instead, he said, "That wasn't love. That was control dressed up as concern." Hearing someone else name it, without hesitation, without doubt, felt like stepping into sunlight. With Marcus, problems weren't competitions, they were puzzles, shared ones. When he talked about his career, he didn't assume mine would bend around it. When I talked about mine, he didn't shrink. That's when I understood what had been missing all along. Partnership. Not permission, not sacrifice masquerading as devotion. Just two people choosing each other without erasing themselves. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later. Colin flew to Seattle unannounced. He showed up outside my apartment building early in the morning, looking unhinged, exhausted, desperate. He demanded we talk. I agreed to meet in public at a coffee shop because I was done being cornered. Over coffee, he cycled through familiar tactics. "It was a test," he said. "You filed a lawsuit," I replied. "We could start over here," he tried. "You tried to ruin my career," I said calmly. Then came the entitlement. "You owe me," he said, "after wasting 5 years of my life." That was the moment something in me settled permanently. "I didn't waste your time," I told him. "You chose control over compromise. Every consequence after that was your choice." When he threatened to ruin my reputation in Seattle, I didn't argue. I just looked at him. And that was when Marcus walked in, early for lunch, unaware of the tension. He introduced himself politely, asked if everything was okay. Watching Colin realize I had moved on, not just emotionally, but structurally, was the end. Not because he lost me, but because he lost the power he thought he had. And I walked away knowing, finally, that choosing myself wasn't selfish. It was survival.